So on that note, let's start. So like everything else, data-driven decision-making needs data. I have some fun quotes here that basically summarizes why biodiversity data is so necessary. We are trying to make summations and derive strategies pertaining to biodiversity without really having the underlying data to actually support these hypotheses that we are making. In a simple setting, there are 6 parts to any form of data-driven decision-making processes. First, you set the objectives. Then you've got to identify, collect the data, organize it, explore it, analyze it. Then we start to infer conclusions, and finally, we can implement and evaluate the outcomes. And the same holds true for biodiversity. It's not possible to jump from step 1 through to step 6, because that can easily lead to flawed decisions and the lack of evidence to actually prove that those are flawed. Therefore, as companies and institutions begin to navigate through this need to implement biodiversity strategies, it becomes imperative that the correct data is actually collected, explored, and analyzed in order to reach more suitable conclusions and decisions. Simple example, you would not enter into a new market without first actually understanding the opportunities that exist within that market. And that would generally be based on underlying market and data analysis. And what complicates the matter even more is that there's a range of frameworks that are coming out, setting out base rules, regulations, guidelines for companies. Most of these, though, tend to place more emphasis on nature rather than biodiversity. Granted, biodiversity is a subset of nature, but it does have its own set of rules and functions. And regardless, even at the simplest level, biodiversity-related disclosures still require underlying data for reporting purposes. And so the main question for me tends to be how meaningful is the data? Granted, biodiversity data is complex to source and understand, especially with the intricate relationships that exist in nature. But following the data-driven decision-making process, it is necessary to be able to explore and analyze the data to draw real conclusions. And as per the situation of banking on false hypotheses based on the lack of data, one risks a similar flawed outcome as a result of misunderstanding or actually misinterpreting the data. So for example, one could report on number of hectares under protection, but without actually understanding the required species mix in that location and their interdependencies, would there actually be value in merely saying this is how much area is protected? There are some well-known biodiversity databases that are already available to companies and financial institutions as tools to help solve this problem. One of the key ones, which is powered by IUCN, is IBAT, which also provides you access to IUCN STAR data. However, these tend to be more your global map data sets. They allow the user to access reports and understand ecosystem intactness. Does not necessarily provide you that granular level of biodiversity data beyond understanding the numbers, for example, of species in a site relative to the red list. Then we have GBIF, which is a very useful open source international facility that gives its users access to scientific biodiversity data and species level observation data. However, this data set is still imperfect and does not include information on all species and from all sources. One unfortunate example is actually a thing like a vulture. You would think there would be data on it, but we've actually encountered issues of trying to get vulture data from the GBIF dataset. We then have sources like eBird, similar to iNaturalist, which offers users access to citizen science records for global bird species. It's often used by scientists, researchers, and amateur naturalists with distribution and abundance information about birds in real time. But what does this data actually mean to a non-specialist? So then we get to the point of actually processing the data with people like Iceberg Labs, Data Labs. They process the data to calculate a corporate biodiversity footprint using the mean species abundance metric. Now, while the MSA is a commonly referred to metric, it also has its shortfalls in terms of actual understanding and interpretation, and in selecting the comparative properties against which the metric is calculated. So in order to provide more clarity and transparency for decision makers, we have been developing the biodiversity database. The purpose is to provide the businesses with that granular area-specific species data. This is to provide decision makers with the knowledge in order to make better informed decisions. For example, including data details such as species-specific life histories, population trends, interactions. This is all vital to access and understand, as is necessary to better comprehend the impacts and implications of actions in a specific area. By understanding life histories, one can understand birth rates, mortality rates, sex ratios. Comparatively, by understanding those interactions between species, is no longer just important to determine whether you have an impact on an endangered species, but also what are those other species in the area that are necessary to sustain that endangered species. As a simple example, one may pay attention to likes of an Arctic fox because they look cute. But in order to ensure the survival of an Arctic fox, one should also consider the trends of the local lemming populations. In a similar case, one that's become quite famous, the gray wolves in the Yellowstone National Park. For people who have attended most of my webinars, I tend to always come back to the Yellowstone National Park gray wolves. But they've shown how the presence of the wolves has re-engineered the environment. These key interactions help to sustain the health and the intactness of the local ecosystems. So the biodiversity database essentially is there to give access to this more focused data in the form of a database marketplace, allowing researchers, companies, nature techs, and citizen science providers to be able to share and sell their data in a centralized aggregator. So why is all of this data so important? Essentially, access to this sort of data allows various stakeholders to be able to do various things. For example, you can start to manage biodiversity and understand how to adjust or adapt strategies to limit the negative impact and maximize the positive impact on biodiversity. This is critical considering the global biodiversity framework and the 30 by 30 goals, and that the world is awakening to the fact that biodiversity holds the key to our own survival and the mitigation of the climate crisis we're facing. From a company perspective, companies are being placed under more pressure to begin to report on their biodiversity impact. This can potentially be a daunting task, especially in terms of what data to report on, where or how to access and actually interpret that data. Especially considering the fact that biodiversity can offer direct and indirect cost benefits to the companies, that they're able to, especially if they're able to embrace the synergistic relationship that they can share with biodiversity. In order to understand these opportunities, it begins to be necessary to understand the species within the region and the respective interactions between those species. For example, if you want to support pollinators, what flowers should be present? Or if you want to reduce the use of pesticide costs, what natural predators could be encouraged? Now, conversely, what risks exist relative to biodiversity would be, for the same pesticide example, if you were to remove all the natural predators, there's the risk of increased rodent populations, which would result in the company having to incur costs to chemically remove those rodents. And this could have an increase or that increased negative knock-on effect on biodiversity impact due to chemicals that can adversely affect other species. So having access to this understandable biodiversity data means that biodiversity strategies and policies can be based on real information, and that allows them to be more robustly developed. These become more viable as they're backed by data rather than suppositions. Likewise, data and the periodic changes in the data would then allow stakeholders to effectively monitor and track their footprints and adjust those strategies to, again, maximize benefits, minimize the costs. And finally, access to data would allow investors to more easily and readily invest in nature due to the increased transparency, accountability, and understanding of how the investments are impacting or being impacted by biodiversity. And now we come back to one downside of biodiversity data. What do we do with it, and how do we begin to understand it? There, in fact, is plenty to do with biodiversity data. And as I explained, there are some significant benefits to having access to robust and verifiable data. But more often than not, the language of biodiversity is understood by specialist ecologists, conservationists, biologists, zoologists, in the same way as a medical procedure would be understood primarily by a medical professional. But this becomes challenging when asking companies and investors who generally are not biodiversity specialists to use and interpret the data and processed indices. To give an example, as an equity analyst, my specialty was in finance, financial modeling, and financial analysis. So how can an MSA or one of the common indexes like a Shannon or Simpson index play a role in this arena? Perhaps through peer multiple valuations or relative valuations, but again, that requires a whole new level of re-education. And while we understand a PE or an EV/EBITDA, and the lower the number, the cheaper it is, the higher the number, more risky and expensive it is, what would a price to diversity or a price to abundance or an EV to MSA mean? Is it necessarily good to have a low price to abundance? Is that something that's good for biodiversity and biodiversity impact? It's something that's yet to be explored. So instead, what EW promotes is that it's possible to use the same data to calculate actual financial values for biodiversity, both for individual species and richness. These financial values, and I'm stressing the financial values, not just values, because I know a lot of people now are talking about biodiversity values, and they're referring actually to indices, not to real values. So these financial values allow all stakeholders to begin to actually engage with biodiversity data at a level that allows it to be understood, interpreted, and used like all other data categories. By understanding financial values, biodiversity can be directly integrated into the whole decision-making process. And this is what's so critical, because then it can also be used within the standard reporting processes. People are accustomed to seeing financial values for livestock, for property, for humans. So why not for biodiversity? So this is the ultimate use of biodiversity data. It transforms biodiversity data into a universal statistic that is openly accessible to all internal and external stakeholders. However, this cannot be done without that underlying reliable biodiversity data. Therefore, the biodiversity data within itself has the capability of actually opening the eyes of the greater global community as to the value that species and richness have for society, the economy, and the environment. Biodiversity data is therefore a fundamental tool for driving real change through the stakeholder value chain. And that's it from me.